Margaret Wilson stood by the kitchen window, watching the late afternoon sunlight spill across her backyard. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their red and pink blossoms bright against the weathered wooden fence. It was a view she had known for nearly 40 years, a view that carried memories of laughter, celebrations, and countless ordinary days that had somehow become precious. She smiled softly as she placed a tray of freshly baked biscuits on the dining table. Today, her family was coming over. At 72 years old, Margaret no longer moved as quickly as she once had, but she still took pride in preparing meals whenever her son and his family visited. The ritual brought her comfort. It reminded her that despite the passing years, some things remained unchanged. Or so she believed. A car pulled into the driveway. "They're here," she whispered to herself. Moments later, the front door opened. "Grandma!" shouted 12-year-old Emma as she rushed inside. Margaret's face brightened immediately. "There's my favorite granddaughter." Emma laughed. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Soon the house filled with familiar voices. Her son Daniel entered carrying a bag of groceries. Behind him came Rebecca, his wife, holding a dessert container. For a while, everything felt normal. Everyone gathered around the table, sharing food and stories. Emma talked excitedly about school. Her younger brother Noah described a science project he was building. Margaret listened with genuine interest. These moments meant everything to her. After losing her husband, Robert, 18 years earlier, family had become the center of her world. She still remembered the difficult years after Robert's passing. Daniel had been young then, struggling to establish himself in life. Margaret had worked extra hours, skipped vacations, and sacrificed countless comforts to help him build a future. She never regretted a single moment. Seeing Daniel succeed had always been enough. As dinner continued, Margaret noticed Rebecca studying the house again. It wasn't the first time. Over the past year, Rebecca had frequently commented on the property's value. "You know," Rebecca said casually while sipping tea, "houses in this neighborhood are selling for remarkable prices." Margaret offered a polite smile. "So I've heard." Daniel nodded. "You could probably get a very good amount if you decided to sell." Margaret's smile faded slightly. The subject had appeared before. Many times. She knew where the conversation was heading. "I don't have any plans to sell," she said gently. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Daniel. Margaret noticed. Lately, she had noticed many things. The subtle looks, the carefully chosen questions, the growing interest in her finances. At first, she had convinced herself she was imagining it. Now she wasn't so sure. The evening moved on, but an uncomfortable tension lingered beneath the surface. Eventually, the grandchildren wandered into the living room to watch a movie. The adults remained at the table. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we should probably talk." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "About what?" Daniel leaned forward. "About your future." There it was. The conversation she had been avoiding. Margaret folded her hands calmly. "My future? You live alone," Daniel said. "You're getting older." Margaret forced a smile. "I wasn't aware 72 meant I was incapable of taking care of myself. That's not what I mean." Rebecca spoke next. "We're concerned about you." Margaret looked at her carefully. "Concern? Of course." Daniel nodded. "We think it's time to start considering other options." Margaret already knew what those options would be. She had heard pieces of this discussion before. Such as, Rebecca answered first, an assisted living community. The room suddenly felt smaller. Margaret looked around her kitchen. The curtains she had sewn herself. The clock Robert had bought during their first anniversary. The table where Daniel had done his homework every evening. Every corner held memories. "This is my home," she said quietly. Daniel sighed. "We know. I raised you in this house." "We know, Mom. I cared for your father in this house when he was sick." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "That's exactly why moving would be better." Margaret stared at him. Better for whom? Silence followed. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Daniel looked away. The answer was obvious. Margaret's heart sank. For months, she had tried to ignore the signs. Now, they stood directly in front of her. Daniel finally spoke. "The house is too much responsibility." "For me?" "Yes." "No, Daniel," Margaret replied softly. I think it's become an inconvenience for you. His expression hardened. That's not fair, isn't it? The tension in the room deepened. Years of unspoken frustrations seemed to rise between them. Daniel's voice became sharper. We spent a lot of time worrying about you. I never asked you to. That's not the point. Then what is the point? For a moment, nobody spoke. Margaret could see impatience growing in her son's face. It startled her. When had he become so quick to anger? When had conversations started feeling like negotiations? Daniel stood up abruptly. The point is that we're trying to help. By pushing me out of my own home. No one's pushing you out. It certainly feels that way. Rebecca attempted to intervene. But Margaret raised a hand. No, let him speak. Daniel's jaw tightened. You refuse to listen. I'm listening. No, you're not. His voice echoed through the kitchen. From the living room, the movie sound suddenly seemed very far away. Margaret looked at her son, the little boy she had once carried to bed after nightmares. The teenager she had encouraged through every disappointment. The young man she had supported through every challenge. She barely recognized the person standing before her. Daniel took a deep breath. Then the words came. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. You're not family anymore. The room froze. Margaret blinked. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard incorrectly. Daniel continued. You're just making life harder for everyone. Silence crashed over the house. Rebecca's eyes widened. Even she looked shocked. Neither grandchild moved from the living room doorway, where they had quietly appeared during the argument. Emma looked confused. Noah looked frightened. Margaret sat perfectly still. Inside, something shattered. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet breaking deep within her heart. After everything, after a lifetime of sacrifice, after every sleepless night, after every struggle she had endured to give Daniel opportunities she never had. Those are the words he chose. You're not family anymore. Margaret felt tears threatening to rise, but she refused to let them. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. Her voice remained calm, remarkably calm. If that's how you feel, she said, then I understand. Daniel looked surprised. Perhaps he had expected an argument. Perhaps he had expected tears. She gave him neither. The grandchildren stared at her. Rebecca looked down at the table. Nobody seemed to know what to say next. Margaret slowly stood. I think it's time for everyone to go home. Mom, Daniel began, but she shook her head. No. Her tone remained gentle. I think we're finished for tonight. One by one, they gathered their things. The grandchildren hugged her goodbye. Emma held on a little longer than usual. Margaret kissed her forehead. Then they left. The house became silent. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside. Margaret remained alone in her living room. Finally, she walked to an old cabinet and removed several photo albums. She sat beneath a lamp and turned the pages. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, school graduations, family dinners, smiling faces from happier times. She paused on a photograph of young Daniel, standing beside his father. Both were laughing. The image blurred as tears finally escaped her eyes. For a long time, she simply sat there, remembering, grieving, accepting. Near midnight, Margaret carefully closed the final album. She gathered the photographs and placed them inside a large storage box. Then she sealed it. The gesture felt strangely symbolic, like closing a chapter of her life. She looked around the quiet room, the same room where her entire world had changed in a single evening. Then she whispered softly into the silence, "If I'm no longer family." Her voice trembled but did not break. Then it's time I stopped living like I am. And for the first time since hearing those devastating words, a new thought entered her mind. Not sorrow, not anger, a decision, one that would change everything. The next morning began quietly. Margaret woke before sunrise, as she always did. For a few moments, lying beneath her quilt, she forgot what had happened the night before. Then the memory returned with painful clarity. You're not family anymore. The words echoed through her mind. She stared at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar wave of sadness. It came, but something else came with it. Resolve. Slowly, Margaret sat up and looked around her bedroom. The photographs on the dresser, the books she had collected over decades, the handmade blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Everything around her represented a life she had built through perseverance and love. No one could take that away. She rose, dressed, and made herself a simple breakfast. For the first time in years, she did not reach for the phone to check whether Daniel had called. She did not wonder whether Rebecca needed help with the grandchildren. She did not plan her day around anyone else's schedule. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat on the back porch. The morning air was cool and fresh. Birds hopped through the garden. The roses swayed gently in the sunlight. Margaret realized something surprising. The world had not ended. Her heart still hurt, but the sky remained blue. The birds still sang. Life continued, and perhaps it was time for her to continue with it. Over the following days, Daniel did not call. Neither did Rebecca. Part of Margaret had expected at least an apology. Another part had known better. Daniel had always been stubborn. Even as a child, admitting he was wrong had never come easily. Margaret decided she would not wait. For years, she had built her life around being available whenever her family needed her. Now she began asking herself a question she had not considered in decades. What do I need? At first, she didn't know the answer. The realization was unsettling. She had spent so much time caring for others that she had forgotten how to care for herself. One afternoon, while organizing a closet, she found an old flyer tucked inside a box. It advertised a local community arts club. Margaret smiled. Years ago, she had loved painting. After Robert passed away, she gradually abandoned the hobby. There had always been something more important to do. Someone else to help. Someone else's problem to solve. Now, standing in the dusty closet, she made a decision. The following Tuesday, she attended her first meeting. The community center buzzed with conversation. Margaret almost turned around at the entrance. Everyone seemed busy talking and laughing. She suddenly felt self-conscious. What if she didn't fit in? What if she was too old? What if she had forgotten how to enjoy herself? Before she could leave, a cheerful voice stopped her. First time, Margaret turned. A woman about her age smiled warmly. She had silver hair and bright eyes. Yes, Margaret admitted. I'm Helen. Margaret. Helen extended a hand. Come sit with us. The invitation was simple, yet it touched Margaret more deeply than she expected. For months, perhaps years, she had felt increasingly invisible. Now someone had welcomed her without expecting anything in return. That afternoon, Margaret painted for the first time in nearly 20 years. Her hands felt awkward at first. The brush moved uncertainly across the canvas. But gradually, memories returned. Colors blended. Shapes emerged. By the end of the session, she felt lighter than she had in a very long time. Weeks passed, then months. Margaret's life slowly transformed. She joined a gardening group. She volunteered at the local library. She attended community events. Most importantly, she made friends. Real friends. People who appreciated her company rather than her usefulness. Helen became especially close. They shared lunches, long conversations, and plenty of laughter. One afternoon, while sitting together in a small cafe, Helen asked a question. You seem happier lately. Margaret smiled. I think I am. Something changed. Margaret stared out the window. For a moment, she considered explaining everything. Then she nodded. Someone once told me I wasn't family anymore. Helen's expression softened. What a terrible thing to say. At the time, yes. And now? Margaret thought carefully. Now I think it forced me to remember who I was before I spent my whole life trying to make everyone else happy. Helen reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Margaret felt an unexpected warmth. Not pity, understanding. There was a difference. Meanwhile, Daniel remained largely unaware of the changes. He assumed his mother needed time to cool down. He expected things to return to normal eventually. After all, they always had. For years, every disagreement ended the same way. Margaret forgave. Margaret accommodated. Margaret moved forward. Daniel never considered that this time might be different. Occasionally, he noticed certain changes. His mother no longer called every Sunday. She no longer offered to watch the children whenever plans changed. Birthday reminders stopped appearing. Friendly messages became rare. Still, he convinced himself it was temporary. He was wrong. One evening, Margaret sat alone at her dining table reviewing old paperwork. The stack before her was surprisingly large. Property records, insurance information, savings accounts, personal documents. For years, she had postponed organizing everything. There had always seemed to be more pressing concerns. Now she approached the task with a clear mind. As she reviewed the papers, another realization settled over her. Much of her future planning had been based on assumptions. Assumptions that no longer felt valid. The events of that family dinner had changed something fundamental. Not merely her relationship with Daniel, her understanding of herself. For the first time, she was making decisions based on what she wanted rather than what others expected. The feeling was strangely empowering. Several days later, Margaret received a recommendation from a friend regarding a respected attorney. At first, she hesitated. Then she remembered Daniel's words. She remembered Rebecca's growing interest in her property. Most of all, she remembered how quickly years of devotion had been dismissed. No, she would not leave important matters unresolved. The following week, she called the attorney's office. An appointment was scheduled. Margaret marked the date on her calendar. Then she continued living her life. Not waiting, not hoping, not chasing approval, simply living. The day of the appointment arrived. The sky was bright and cloudless. Margaret dressed carefully in a navy blue suit she had not worn in years. When she looked in a mirror, she saw someone different from the woman who had sat crying over photo albums months earlier. The sadness remained. Some wounds healed slowly. But strength had returned. Purpose had returned. She gathered a neatly organized folder from her desk. Inside were important documents, financial records, property information, and notes she had spent weeks preparing. Everything she needed. Everything she had finally decided to take control of herself. Margaret locked her front door and walked toward her car. A gentle breeze rustled the trees overhead. For the first time in a long while, the future no longer frightened her. It felt open, full of possibility. A short time later, she parked outside a professional brick building downtown. The attorney's office. She stepped from the car and looked up at the sign. Then she tightened her grip on the folder. Without hesitation, Margaret walked through the front doors. A receptionist greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson." Margaret smiled. "Good morning." The receptionist gestured toward hallway. "Mr. Carter is ready to see you." Margaret nodded. Folder in hand, she followed the hallway toward a meeting room where decisions would soon be made. Decisions that would reshape not only her future, but the future of everyone who had assumed they already knew what it would be. And as the office door slowly opened before her, Margaret stepped inside, ready to begin the next chapter of her life. Margaret stepped into the attorney's office with her folder held firmly against her chest. The room was quiet and professional, lined with shelves filled with legal books and framed certificates. Behind a polished wooden desk sat Mr. Carter, a man in his early 60s whose calm demeanor immediately put her at ease. He stood and offered a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Wilson, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for seeing me." After exchanging greetings, they sat down. Mr. Carter opened a notebook. "How can I help you today?" Margaret took a slow breath. For years, she had postponed these conversations. She had always assumed there would be time later. Now she understood that later was never guaranteed. "I need to update my affairs," she said. The attorney nodded. "Of course." For nearly 2 hours, they reviewed every important aspect of her future planning. Her property, her savings, her healthcare directives, her personal wishes. As the meeting progressed, Mr. Carter noticed something unusual. Most clients approached these discussions with uncertainty. Margaret seemed different. She knew exactly what she wanted. Not because she was angry, not because she sought revenge, but because she had finally stopped allowing others to define her future. When the meeting ended, Mr. Carter organized the documents. "We can prepare everything according to your instructions." Margaret smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." As she left the office, a surprising sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in many years, she felt fully in control of her own life. Summer gradually gave way to autumn. The months passed quietly. Yet those months changed everything. Margaret continued building the life she had begun reclaiming. Every Tuesday, she attended the art club. Every Thursday, she volunteered at the library. Weekends often included community events, gardening projects, or lunch with friends. The loneliness she had feared never completely disappeared. There were still evenings when she looked at old photographs and felt a familiar ache. But the ache no longer controlled her. Life had expanded beyond it. People in the community came to know her not as someone's mother or someone's grandmother. They knew her as Margaret, the kind woman who always remembered names, the talented painter whose landscapes were displayed at local exhibits, the dependable volunteer who never missed a commitment, the friend who listened without judgment. Slowly, she became something she had not been for a very long time, her own person. Meanwhile, Daniel barely noticed the first changes. At first, he assumed his mother simply needed time. A few weeks would pass. Then everything would return to normal. That was how things had always worked. His mother forgave. His mother adapted. His mother stayed. But as autumn arrived, small absences began accumulating. His birthday came and went. No card arrived. No phone call. No message. Daniel found himself checking his phone several times that evening. Nothing. The silence felt strange. Margaret had never forgotten his birthday. Not once. When Rebecca noticed his mood, she asked what was wrong. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. For the first time, he felt the absence of someone he had always taken for granted. A few weeks later, Emma approached him after school. "Dad." "Yes." "When are we visiting Grandma?" Daniel looked up from his laptop. "I don't know." Emma frowned. "We haven't seen her in months. We can call her sometime." "But why haven't we?" Daniel didn't have a good answer. The truth was uncomfortable. After the argument, he had expected Margaret to reach out first. When she didn't, his pride prevented him from making the first move. Now months had passed. The longer he waited, the harder it became. "She's probably busy," he finally said. Emma looked unconvinced. "Grandma was never too busy for us." Her words lingered long after she left the room. By winter, Daniel could no longer ignore reality. Something had changed. Permanently. His mother wasn't waiting. She wasn't chasing reconciliation. She wasn't trying to repair what he had broken. She was simply living without him. One evening, he decided to call. The phone rang several times. Then Margaret answered. "Hello." Her voice was warm, polite, but distant. Not cold, just distant. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Daniel." A brief silence followed. "How have you been?" "Very well." Her answer surprised him. Very well. Not lonely. Not struggling. Not waiting. Very well. They exchanged small talk for several minutes. Weather, health, community events, ordinary subjects. Yet something felt different. The conversation lacked its old intimacy. Margaret no longer volunteered details about her life. She answered questions, but rarely expanded. When the call ended, Daniel felt oddly unsettled. He couldn't explain why. After all, she had been perfectly pleasant. But for the first time, he realized he no longer knew what was happening in his mother's world. The months continued moving forward. Spring arrived. Flowers returned to Margaret's garden. The community center hosted an annual art exhibition. To Margaret's surprise, 3 of her paintings were selected for display. Helen insisted they celebrate. "You deserve this." Margaret laughed. "I've only been painting again for a year. And look how far you've come." During the exhibition, dozens of visitors stopped to admire her work. Some even expressed interest in purchasing pieces. As Margaret stood among friends, listening to conversations and laughter, she felt something she had not experienced in years. Pride. Not the pride of sacrifice. Not the pride of helping others succeed. Personal pride. She had built something for herself. Several weeks later, Daniel received unexpected news. He was attending a neighborhood gathering when he encountered an old family acquaintance. During their conversation, Margaret's name came up. "Your mother is doing wonderfully," the woman said. Daniel smiled politely. "She is?" "Oh, yes." She seemed surprised by his uncertainty. "I saw her at the community center last week. Everyone was talking about her art exhibition." "Art exhibition?" The woman blinked. You didn't know?" Daniel felt a strange knot form in his stomach. "No." "Oh." The woman suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Well, she's become quite involved in the community." Daniel forced a smile. The conversation continued, but he barely heard the rest. "Art exhibition? Community involvement? How much of his mother's life had he missed? A few days later, curiosity drove him to search online. The community center had a website. There, among photographs from recent events, he found pictures of Margaret. She was smiling, genuinely smiling, standing beside paintings, surrounded by friends, participating in activities, looking happier than he had seen her in years. Daniel stared at the screen. Something inside him shifted. For months, perhaps longer, he had unconsciously imagined his mother sitting alone in her house, waiting, missing him, needing him. Instead, she appeared to have built an entirely new life, one that did not revolve around him. The realization was unsettling and humbling. That evening, Daniel found himself thinking about the argument again. For months, he had justified his behavior. He had told himself he was being practical, responsible, concerned. But now, viewing the situation from a distance, certain memories became impossible to ignore. The impatience in his voice, the frustration, the cruelty of his words. Most of all, the expression on Margaret's face when he had said, "You're not family anymore." The memory made him wince. How could he have said that? How had he allowed himself to become that person? Several days later, another surprise arrived. A letter, not from Margaret, from Mr. Carter's law office. Daniel frowned as he opened the envelope. The contents were brief and professional. The attorney requested that he contact the office regarding future administrative matters connected to Margaret's estate planning. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time. Confusion quickly turned into concern. Estate planning? Administrative matters? He immediately called the office. The receptionist politely explained that specific details could not yet be discussed. However, certain arrangements had been finalized according to Margaret's instructions. When the call ended, Daniel sat silently in his office. Something was happening, something significant. For the first time, he began to understand that while he had been waiting for his mother to return to her old role, she had been moving forward, without him. And whatever plans she had made during that attorney meeting nearly a year ago, they were clearly very different from anything he had assumed. As Daniel stared out the window, an uneasy feeling settled over him. The consequences of his words were no longer theoretical. They were real, and he was only beginning to discover how much had changed. Daniel spent the next several days unable to focus. The letter from Mr. Carter's office sat on his desk, its contents replaying endlessly in his mind. For nearly a year, he had convinced himself that time would fix everything. Now he was beginning to understand that time had not repaired the damage. It had simply allowed his mother to build a life that no longer depended on him. And that realization frightened him more than he wanted to admit. A week later, Daniel sat across from Mr. Carter in the same office Margaret had visited months earlier. The attorney remained professional and measured. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to be clear that your mother's personal decisions remain confidential. However, she has authorized me to discuss certain matters that may affect you in the future." Daniel nodded. "Understand." Mr. Carter opened a file. "What I can tell you is that your mother has carefully reviewed and updated all of her legal and financial arrangements." Daniel listened quietly. The attorney continued. "She has also established several plans regarding her property, charitable contributions, and future care." Something about those words made Daniel sit straighter. Charitable contributions? Yes. Daniel hesitated. "Are you saying she's donating part of her estate?" Mr. Carter folded his hands. "Your mother has chosen to support causes and organizations that are meaningful to her." The answer was polite, but the meaning was unmistakable. Daniel felt a wave of shock. For years, he had unconsciously assumed certain things. Not because his mother had promised them, not because she owed them, simply because he had never imagined otherwise. Now he realized how much he had taken for granted. That evening, Rebecca immediately noticed his mood. "What happened?" Daniel sat heavily in a chair. "We were wrong." Rebecca frowned. "About what?" "About Mom." She waited. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "We kept acting like her future belonged to us." Rebecca's expression shifted. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence itself felt like an admission, because deep down, both knew there was truth in what he had said. Over the past few years, conversations about Margaret's home have become increasingly practical. Property values, future plans, long-term arrangements. Rarely have they stopped to ask the most important question. What did Margaret want? For the first time in many months, Daniel found himself revisiting old memories. Not the recent arguments, the older ones, the important ones. He remembered his first bicycle, his first school uniform, the years his mother worked extra shifts after his father died, the countless evenings she sat beside him helping with homework despite being exhausted, the opportunities she had given him, the sacrifices she never mentioned. As these memories resurfaced, something painful became impossible to ignore. His mother had spent decades putting his needs ahead of her own. Yet when she finally chose herself, he had treated it as a problem. The realization left him ashamed. Meanwhile, Margaret remained unaware of the conversation. Her days continued peacefully. Spring had deepened into early summer. The community garden was thriving. Her paintings had become increasingly popular. Most importantly, she felt content. Not because everything was perfect, but because her happiness no longer depended on other people's approval. One afternoon, Helen joined her on the back porch. The two friends sat drinking iced tea while sunlight filtered through the roses. "You seem thoughtful today," Helen observed. Margaret smiled faintly. "I've been thinking about forgiveness." Helen raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious topic." Margaret laughed softly. "I suppose it is." After a moment, she added, "Sometimes people think forgiveness means pretending something never happened." "And you disagree?" "I do." Helen waited. Margaret looked out across the garden. "I think forgiveness begins when the truth is finally acknowledged." The words lingered between them. Helen nodded slowly. "That sounds right." Neither woman said more. They didn't need to. A few weeks later, tensions surfaced within Daniel's household. Rebecca had become increasingly uneasy. The assumptions they once held about Margaret's future had disappeared. Everything was changing. One evening, after the children had gone upstairs, Rebecca finally spoke. "Do you think she'll ever forgive us?" Daniel stared at the dining table. The question hurt because he didn't know the answer. "I don't know." Rebecca looked down. "I should have said something that night." Daniel glanced at her. "The argument?" She nodded. "When you said those words." The memory immediately returned. Sharp and painful. "I knew it was wrong." Rebecca's voice trembled. "But I stayed silent." Neither of them could change the past. And for the first time, they fully understood that. As summer progressed, Daniel began making small attempts to reconnect. He called more often. He sent messages. Occasionally, he invited Margaret to dinner. She was always polite, always courteous, but she no longer rearranged her life to accommodate his. Sometimes she already had plans. Sometimes she was attending community events. Sometimes she was simply busy. The role reversal was startling. Daniel found himself waiting for responses, waiting for opportunities, waiting for time with his mother. The same mother who had once spent years waiting for him. One Saturday afternoon, Emma approached Margaret during a community art fair. The teenager had convinced her father to bring the family. As soon as she spotted her grandmother's booth, she ran over. "Grandma!" Margaret's face brightened immediately. "Emma!" The girl hugged her tightly. Margaret returned the embrace. For a moment, neither wanted to let go. When they finally separated, Emma smiled. "I missed you." Margaret's eyes softened. "I missed you too." Unlike the complicated relationship with Daniel, her bond with the grandchildren remained genuine, pure, untouched by adult mistakes. As they talked, Daniel watched from a distance. He saw the joy in his mother's face. He saw how warmly people greeted her, how many friends stopped to chat, how naturally she belonged in this world she had created. For the first time, he fully grasped what she had built. Not a replacement family, not an act of revenge. A life, a meaningful, fulfilling life. One she had every right to live. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his car after dropping everyone home. The sky was darkening. Streetlights flickered on. For a long time, he simply stared through the windshield. He thought about everything that had happened. The argument, the silence, the months of distance, the opportunities he had wasted. Most of all, he thought about responsibility. Not blame, responsibility. because the truth was no longer avoidable. His mother hadn't pushed him away. He had pushed her away, and she had eventually stopped chasing someone who didn't value her properly. The realization hurt, but it was honest, and honesty was long overdue. The following week, Daniel made a decision. No more phone calls. No more casual messages. No more hoping the problem would somehow solve itself. If there was any chance of repairing the relationship, he needed to face the damage directly. He needed to stop protecting himself from uncomfortable truths. One evening after work, he drove across town. The familiar streets brought back memories from decades earlier. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. Nervousness settled heavily in his chest. What if she refused to see him? What if it was too late? He wouldn't know unless he tried. Finally, he turned onto the quiet street where Margaret had lived for so many years. The house appeared exactly as he remembered. The roses still bloomed along the fence. The porch light glowed warmly in the fading daylight. Daniel parked at the curb. For several moments, he remained seated, gathering courage, preparing himself. Then he stepped out of the car. Slowly, he walked up the familiar pathway. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the front door, he stopped. The words he had rehearsed suddenly seemed inadequate. There was no perfect apology, no magical sentence that could erase what he had done. Only honesty, only accountability. Taking a deep breath, Daniel raised his hand. Then he knocked on the door and waited, knowing that the most important conversation of his life was about to begin. The sound of the knock echoed through the house. Inside, Margaret was in the living room reading a novel when she heard it. She glanced toward the clock. It was later than most visitors usually arrived. Setting the book aside, she stood and walked toward the front door. As she reached for the handle, she had no idea who was waiting on the other side. The moment the door opened, she froze. Daniel stood on the porch, alone. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The evening breeze stirred the roses beside the steps. The familiar silence between them felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Hi, Mom." Margaret studied his face. He looked tired, not physically, emotionally. The confidence she had once associated with him seemed absent. "Hello, Daniel. I know it's late." Margaret remained quiet. "I was hoping we could talk." A long pause followed. Then Margaret stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel entered the house slowly. The familiar scent of tea and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Everything looked almost exactly as he remembered. The framed photographs, the old bookshelf, the clock hanging near the kitchen entrance. For years he had considered this place permanent, unchanging. Now he realized how much he had taken it for granted. Margaret motioned toward the living room. "Sit down." They settled into opposite chairs. For several moments, neither spoke. Daniel suddenly understood why he had been nervous. Because there was nowhere to hide. No distractions. No excuses. Only the truth. Finally, he looked at his mother. "I owe you an apology." Margaret said nothing. She simply listened, and somehow that made it even harder. Daniel swallowed. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times." A faint smile touched Margaret's face. "Has it helped?" "No." To his surprise, she actually laughed softly. The tension eased slightly. Only slightly. Daniel took a deep breath. "I was wrong." The words felt small compared to the damage, but they were necessary. "I was selfish." Margaret remained silent. "I convinced myself I was helping you." His eyes dropped toward the floor. "The truth is that I stopped seeing things from your perspective." Still she listened. No interruption. No rescue. No reassurance. For once, Daniel had to carry the weight of his own actions. "I thought I knew what was best for you." His voice weakened. "And when you disagreed with me, I became frustrated." The memory returned vividly. The argument, the anger, the terrible words. Daniel closed his eyes. "Mom." His voice cracked. "I never should have said what I said." The room grew very quiet. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was calm. "Do you remember exactly what you said?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Every word. Every painful word." "I do." Margaret folded her hands. "Then you understand why things changed." It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the truth. Daniel nodded again. "Yes." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret leaned back in her chair. I spent months asking myself where I went wrong. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? She smiled sadly. When someone devotes their life to their child, they naturally wonder if they fail when the relationship falls apart. Daniel immediately shook his head. No, that's what I eventually realized. Margaret's eyes softened. I didn't fail. The statement carried no bitterness, only clarity. I loved you. Daniel felt tears gathering. I know. I sacrificed for you. I know. I gave everything I could. Daniel lowered his head. I know. Margaret nodded. And that's why I eventually stopped blaming myself. Silence followed. A meaningful silence. The kind that comes when difficult truths are finally spoken aloud. After a while, Daniel asked the question that had haunted him for months. Did you ever hate me? Margaret looked genuinely surprised. No. The answer came immediately. Without hesitation. Without doubt. Daniel blinked. After everything, Margaret smiled faintly. Being hurt and hating someone are very different things. Daniel felt emotion tighten his throat. I hurt you. Yes. The honesty stung. But it mattered. Margaret wasn't pretending. She wasn't minimizing the damage. She was acknowledging it. And somehow that made her forgiveness seem more valuable. They talked for hours. Not about property. Not about money. Not about legal arrangements. About life. About regrets. About misunderstandings. About expectations. Eventually, Margaret shared the lessons she had learned during the past year. When you said I wasn't family anymore, something inside me broke. Daniel winced. The words hurt to hear, but he knew they were true. For a while, I thought my life was over. She looked around the room. Then I realized something. What? Margaret smiled. My worth was never supposed to depend on someone else's approval. Daniel sat quietly, listening, learning. I had spent so many years being a mother that I forgot how to be Margaret. A gentle warmth entered her voice. So, I found her again. Daniel thought about the art exhibitions, the community events, the friendships, the happiness he had witnessed. For the first time, he truly understood. She hadn't moved on from her family. She had rediscovered herself. Later that evening, Daniel finally asked the question he feared most. Can you forgive me? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She considered the question carefully. At last she spoke. I already forgive you. Daniel stared at her. Shock spread across his face. You do? Yes. Tears filled his eyes. Then why does everything still feel so distant? Margaret's expression remained gentle. Because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. The words settled heavily between them. I forgave you months ago. Daniel struggled to speak. But trust takes longer. He nodded slowly, understanding. For the first time, he truly understood. A broken window can be repaired, but it doesn't become whole the instant someone says sorry. Healing requires time, patience, consistency, effort. As midnight approached, Daniel stood to leave. Neither of them expected one conversation to solve everything. Life didn't work that way. Relationships didn't work that way. But something important had happened. A door that had nearly closed forever had opened again. At the front entrance, Daniel hesitated. Thank you for letting me come. Margaret smiled. Thank you for coming. Then for the first time in over a year, mother and son embraced. The hug was different from those of the past. Less automatic. More meaningful. Neither took it for granted. The months that followed brought gradual change. Not dramatic change. Real change. Daniel called regularly. Not out of obligation. Because he genuinely wanted to hear how his mother was doing. He visited more often. He listened more carefully. He stopped assuming. He started appreciating. Trust did not return overnight. But little by little it grew. Just as a garden grows after a difficult season. One day at a time. A year later, Margaret stood in the community center surrounded by friends. Her newest art exhibition had just opened. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Helen stood nearby, discussing one of the paintings. Emma proudly introduced visitors to her grandmother. Noah helped arrange refreshments. Across the room stood Daniel, watching, smiling. Not because he owned any part of her success. Not because he expected anything in return. Simply because he was proud of her, as he should have been all along. Margaret noticed him and smiled. He smiled back. The relationship wasn't perfect. Perhaps it never would be. but it was honest, and honesty was stronger than pretense. Looking around the room, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She was surrounded by people who valued her, people who respected her, people who appreciated her presence rather than merely her usefulness. Most importantly, she had learned a lesson that changed her life. Family was not defined by blood alone. Family was built through respect, through gratitude, through kindness, through showing up when it mattered. Years earlier, the words, "You're not family anymore," had shattered her heart. But those same words had unknowingly led her towards something unexpected, a life she had nearly forgotten she deserved. And as laughter filled the room and loved ones gathered around her, Margaret realized that losing one version of family had allowed her to discover a deeper understanding of what family truly means. Not possession, not obligation, but love freely given and gratefully returned. And that, she thought with a peaceful smile, made all the difference.